this episode, we turn to a group of ideas that many new learners hear often but do not always separate clearly at first, and that confusion can cause real trouble in artificial intelligence, AI governance. Transparency, choice, lawful basis, and purpose limits are closely related, but they are not interchangeable, and a system can look strong in one of these areas while still being weak in another. A company may tell people that AI is involved and still fail to give them meaningful control. It may rely on a lawful reason for processing data and still use that data for purposes that stretch too far from what was originally justified. It may offer some form of user choice, but still present that choice in a confusing or unfair way that does not feel real. The reason this lesson matters is that responsible governance depends on understanding how these ideas work together without blending them into one vague promise about being open or compliant. Once you can hear the difference between notice, real choice, legal justification, and clear purpose boundaries, it becomes much easier to evaluate whether an AI system is being used in a disciplined and trustworthy way. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Transparency is usually the easiest word to recognize, but it is also one of the easiest to misuse because organizations sometimes treat it as a simple communication exercise instead of a practical governance responsibility. At its core, transparency means that people should be able to understand enough about the system and its role to make sense of what is happening around them. That does not mean every person needs a deep technical explanation of the model, the mathematics, or the code. It means the right people should receive enough clarity about the use of AI, the purpose of the system, the kind of outputs it produces, and the limits that matter in the situation they are in. A customer interacting with an automated tool may need to know that automation is involved and where human help is available. An employee asked to rely on an AI output may need to know whether the system is giving advice or shaping a real decision. Transparency becomes meaningful when it helps people understand the role of the system in the actual context, not when it hides behind vague language that sounds modern and responsible but tells them very little. That is why notice matters so much. A notice is one of the main ways transparency becomes real, because it is the point where the organization tells people that AI is being used, what the system is doing at a high level, and how that use may affect them. Weak notice tends to be broad, generic, and distant from the real interaction. It may sit in a long policy document nobody sees at the moment the system matters, or it may mention automated processing in such abstract language that an ordinary person cannot tell whether the rule applies to the situation in front of them. Stronger notice is more timely, more specific, and more connected to actual impact. It helps a person understand that an AI tool is summarizing their interaction, ranking their content, assisting a reviewer, or helping shape how a request is handled. Good notice is not meant to overwhelm people with legal text or technical detail. It is meant to reduce surprise, support fair expectations, and help people recognize when automation is part of the environment they are navigating. Transparency also has an internal side that beginners sometimes overlook. It is not only something organizations owe to customers, applicants, or members of the public. It is also something organizations owe to their own workers, reviewers, and decision-makers. An employee cannot use an AI tool responsibly if they do not understand what it is meant to do, what data it is allowed to handle, what its known weaknesses are, and what kind of human review is still expected. A manager cannot govern a system well if they do not know where the model came from, what its intended use is, or whether later teams have quietly expanded that use beyond what was originally approved. Internal transparency therefore supports accountability just as much as external notice supports fairness and trust. When teams inside an organization do not have a shared understanding of how an AI system functions and what boundaries surround it, governance becomes fragile because people begin relying on assumption rather than informed judgment. Strong transparency makes the system easier to question, easier to oversee, and harder to misuse through confusion alone. Choice is the next idea, and it often causes confusion because people sometimes treat it as if it automatically solves every concern around transparency. It does not. Choice means that an individual has some real ability to influence whether or how the AI system is used in relation to them, their data, or their interaction. In some settings, that may mean opting in, opting out, selecting a non-automated path, or deciding how much information to provide. In other settings, meaningful choice may be limited or unavailable because the context is more constrained, the service depends on some form of automation, or the organization relies on a different legal basis for the activity. The important point is that choice is about practical control, not just awareness. A person can know that AI is present and still have no meaningful way to avoid its use. That is why governance has to treat transparency and choice as related but separate. Being told something is happening is not the same as being given a fair opportunity to shape what happens next. A meaningful choice also has to be understandable, workable, and free from manipulation. If a company buries the option deep inside confusing settings, presents the automated path as the only reasonable path, or makes the non-automated route so slow and inconvenient that almost nobody can use it, the appearance of choice may be stronger than the reality. This matters because organizations can satisfy themselves too easily with technical availability while ignoring the actual experience of the person supposedly being empowered. Good governance asks whether the person can understand the decision they are being asked to make, whether the consequences of that decision are explained with enough honesty, and whether the path to a different option is realistic rather than symbolic. Choice also becomes less meaningful when people do not know what kind of system they are choosing around. If the notice was too weak to explain that the tool is profiling, ranking, summarizing, or influencing a reviewer, then the later option to accept or decline some part of that process may not rest on an informed foundation. A strong approach treats meaningful choice as a design problem, not only a legal formality. Lawful basis is the concept that often feels the most legal, but it becomes easier to understand once you step back from legal jargon and hear the practical question underneath it. Lawful basis asks what legitimate reason the organization has for using data or applying AI in the way it plans to do. In other words, why is this use justified at all? Some organizations make the mistake of assuming that if a system is useful, efficient, or popular, then its use is automatically acceptable. That is not enough. Responsible governance requires an actual basis for the activity, especially when personal information is involved or when the system affects people in meaningful ways. The reason this matters so much in AI is that the technology can make it tempting to collect more data, infer more characteristics, automate more judgment, and stretch the purpose of the system beyond what would have felt justified in a more traditional setting. Lawful basis acts as a brake on that drift by forcing the organization to ask what grounds it is relying on before the system becomes normal simply because it is available. It is also important to separate lawful basis from consent or other forms of user choice, because beginners often blend those ideas together. Sometimes an organization may rely on a person's agreement to a certain kind of data use or automated feature, but not every AI use case depends on that kind of permission. In other cases, the organization may rely on a different reason tied to service delivery, legal obligation, security, fraud prevention, or another recognized basis for the activity. The point is not to memorize a legal catalog in this lesson. The point is to understand that lawful basis is the organization's justification for acting, while choice is the individual's practical ability to influence whether or how that action affects them. Those two ideas may overlap, but they do not always travel together. A company can have a lawful basis for a certain form of processing and still owe people strong notice and fair treatment. A company can also ask for agreement in a way that sounds voluntary, while the surrounding design makes the choice weak or confusing. Governance becomes stronger when these concepts are kept separate enough that each one can be evaluated honestly. Purpose limits, sometimes described more broadly as purpose limitation, add another crucial boundary. Purpose limits mean that information and systems should be used for clear, defined reasons rather than continuously stretched into new roles just because they seem useful. This is especially important in AI because the same model or dataset can often be reused across many possible tasks, which creates a strong temptation to expand without pausing for fresh review. A tool introduced to summarize customer support messages might later be used to score employee tone, detect frustration, or prioritize complaints in ways that were never part of the original justification. Data gathered for fraud prevention might later be proposed for personalization, internal analytics, or model refinement without a clear governance conversation about whether those new purposes fit the original basis and the expectations of the people affected. Purpose limits protect against this kind of quiet expansion. They force the organization to ask whether the new use is genuinely connected to the original reason or whether the system is drifting into a materially different activity that deserves new scrutiny, new explanation, and possibly a different path altogether. This idea matters because function creep is one of the most common ways AI systems become more invasive, more opaque, and more harmful over time. Function creep happens when a system slowly accumulates new uses, new data sources, new audiences, or new decision power without a clear moment of reconsideration. Each step may look small on its own, but together they can transform a relatively low-impact tool into something much more sensitive. A summarization assistant becomes a monitoring tool. A recommendation feature becomes a gatekeeping feature. A support tool becomes a scoring system that shapes opportunities or outcomes. When purpose limits are weak, organizations often tell themselves they are simply getting more value from the technology they already have. In reality, they may be entering a new governance space with different obligations and different risks while still relying on old approvals that were never meant to cover the expanded use. Strong purpose limits help stop that drift by making teams justify meaningful changes instead of treating them as natural extensions that require no real discussion. Once you place these ideas side by side, their connection becomes clearer. Transparency answers whether people and internal stakeholders can understand enough about the use of AI to orient themselves properly. Choice answers whether affected people have real influence over that use in the situations where such influence is appropriate or expected. Lawful basis answers why the organization is entitled to act in that way at all. Purpose limits answer whether the system and the data remain within the boundaries that originally justified the use. When one of these pillars is missing, the others do not automatically compensate for it. A very transparent notice does not create a lawful basis where none exists. A lawful basis does not excuse unlimited expansion into unrelated purposes. An option to opt out does not repair a use case that was never justified or never explained clearly enough for people to understand its impact. Governance becomes much more disciplined when these ideas are treated as complementary checks rather than as interchangeable signs of responsibility. That discipline helps organizations avoid superficial compliance and focus instead on whether the system is operating fairly, intelligibly, and within defensible limits. These questions become especially important in higher impact contexts where AI can influence access, opportunity, pricing, employment, services, safety, or other areas that matter deeply to people's lives. In such settings, weak transparency may leave individuals unaware that automation is shaping their treatment. Weak choice may make it difficult to seek a human path or contest outcomes. Weak lawful basis may mean the organization is relying on technology-driven convenience rather than a well-grounded justification. Weak purpose limits may allow a system to grow from helpful support into broader surveillance or profiling without serious review. Even when no single failure looks dramatic in isolation, the combined effect can be a governance model that feels unfair and hard to challenge. That is why these concepts matter beyond legal interpretation. They shape trust, dignity, and the quality of human experience when people interact with organizations using AI. A system can be technically sophisticated and still feel unacceptable if people do not know what is happening, cannot influence it where appropriate, cannot understand why it is justified, or see it spreading into uses they never expected. From an operational perspective, organizations need to build these ideas into policy, design, review, and training rather than treating them as words for legal teams to interpret in isolation. Product and business teams need guidance on when notice must be specific and timely. Designers need to understand what makes choice meaningful instead of merely visible. Governance reviewers need to ask what lawful basis supports a particular data use or automated function and whether that justification still fits as the system evolves. Data and risk teams need to track whether new purposes have appeared and whether those new purposes stay close enough to the original approval to remain acceptable. Users and managers need to know when a system's use has crossed a boundary that requires escalation rather than quiet normalization. When these ideas are embedded operationally, they help the organization notice trouble early. When they remain only as abstract policy language, teams often keep moving until a customer complaint, public criticism, or internal incident forces a conversation that should have happened much sooner. A beginner should also understand that strong governance in this area is not about turning every interaction into a dramatic moment of warning and consent. The goal is proportionality and clarity, not noise. If notice is constant but meaningless, people stop listening. If every minor tool demands the same heavy interaction, the system becomes harder to use without becoming more responsible. The answer is to match transparency, choice, legal review, and purpose discipline to the seriousness of the use. Some contexts may call for brief disclosure and simple guardrails. Others may require richer explanation, more deliberate user control, stronger review of the legal basis, and tighter restrictions on reuse and expansion. This kind of calibration is one of the most important marks of mature AI governance because it shows that the organization is not simply copying slogans. It is learning how to adapt core principles to real situations while keeping the differences between those principles clear enough that each one can do its job. As you finish this lesson, hold on to one simple way of hearing the whole topic. Transparency is about understanding. Choice is about practical control where that control should exist. Lawful basis is about justification. And purpose limits are about boundaries that keep a use from drifting beyond what was originally defensible. Responsible AI governance depends on all four because AI systems make it easy to scale hidden influence, blur explanations, normalize weak choices, expand into new purposes, and rely on convenience where stronger reasoning is required. Once you can separate these ideas and then reconnect them thoughtfully, you are in a much better position to judge whether an AI system is being used in a way that is fair, disciplined, and worthy of trust. That is the deeper lesson here. Governance is not only about asking whether the organization told people something or obtained a broad permission once. It is about asking whether the system remains understandable, justified, appropriately bounded, and respectful of real human agency as it moves through everyday use.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.